各位，如果说现在的世界正在进入一个文明冲突的新时代，那杨永文，也就是新加坡前外长，在这一场对话中给出了出人意料的冷静解读。亨廷顿在1997年提出文明冲突论，许多人认为他们已经过时了，但杨永文提醒我们，当基于规则和制度的国际秩序逐渐松动，当多极化加速，文明的力量又开始显现了。他的论述很尖锐，中国有着清晰的文明认同，危机时的本能是关闭城门，收缩防御。俄罗斯正是恰恰的相反，受到了威胁时会选择扩张。而西方文明呢，在觉醒文化和自我解构的浪潮中，它正在削弱自己的根基，却仍习惯用欧洲方式去理解中国，把中国当作是自己的镜像，甚至用提修斯之船、伯罗奔尼撒战争这些典故来预测中西的冲突。但杨永文直言，这种假设本身就是一种风险，因为中国从未像苏联那样有扩张的本能，它的本性决定了冲突并非必然。而耐人寻味的是它的经济对比，西方仍在高通胀和货币泛滥作战，而中国与东南亚整体却保持稳健。新加坡 3% 的 GDP 增长和 4% 的利率，低于 6% 的通胀，在欧洲或者美国简直让人羡慕。过去3年，中国在全球疫情中损失最小。2022年上海调控期间，其贸易顺差依然飙升到870亿美元。杨永文强调，这意味着中国拥有巨大的政策灵活性，在利率、货币政策、贸易韧性方面完全不同于西方。在地缘政治上，他的观察同样犀利。乌克兰战争在某种程度上帮了中国一忙，美国的战略焦点从中国转向俄罗斯，给中国缓冲的空间。中国既在经济上支持俄罗斯，又谨慎避免军事的介入，还把自己摆在一个和平调解者的位置上。杨永文认为，未来的世界会呈现多极结构，中国、美国、欧洲和印度、俄罗斯还有像东盟这些群体级互相连接，犹如无数的交织成网。他的结论耐人寻味，要理解中国，必须深入它的历史和文化的脉络。西方若一味地切断自身的传统，以觉醒代替根基，只会失去原有的平衡。太极的道理刚刚好适用，根扎得越深，行动就越自由。一旦失去了根，就会被风吹倒。杨永文的提醒更像是一记当头棒喝。世界的未来不再是谁取代谁的线性竞争，而是多极共生的复杂博弈。真正的问题是，当西方继续用自己的镜像套用中国的时候，是否已经错过了理解这个东方文明的关键呢？而中国又能否在守住根基的同时，和其他文明建立更深的触觉连接呢？让我们看一下视频。
I suppose the other thing that comes out of that, George, is does this mean that we're in a clash of civilizations format now? That if the international order as an institutional rules-based order is fading away, that we're now facing what Huntington called a clash of civilizations in 1997, becoming more a feature of what becomes a multipolar world, that you've got a very clear Chinese sense of a civilization, you've got a Russian sense of its own civilization, you've got an India with a sense of its own civilization, and a West that's kind of undermining its own civilization through wokeness. Do you think this is the paradigm for the world going forward?
The danger in the West is you see China in your own image, against your own template. So all this theorizing over the Thucydidean trap and the Peloponnesian War, that somehow China fits into a European paradigm. Of course, there's equivalent danger on the other side, that China sees others in its own image. But it's a much smaller danger than Europeans seeing China in its own image. If China were like the Soviet Union, evangelical, expansionary, then yes, the clash is inevitable. But that's not China's nature. Their instinct is, when there's a crisis, shut the gates, keep out the foreigners, keep Chinese in. That's always been their instinct. It is not the Russian instinct. The Russian instinct is, when I'm threatened, I expand. The more I'm threatened, the more I have to expand. The Chinese instinct is, the more I'm threatened, the more I hunker down and block out foreigners. So for decades under Mao Zedong, when they were finding their own self, they just kept out foreigners. I know this personally because my mother came from China. My parents were married in China in 1937. A month later, the Japanese invaded, they rushed back. She left China as a young bride of 19. She could not go back to 1978. So during those decades, China turned inwards. That is the nature of Chinese society. So with China, with Russia, I'm not enough of an expert. I think there will be a clash. But with China, there's no necessary clash.
So in terms of the evolving world picture, and particularly in geo-economic terms, as you said, you know, the West seems to be facing an ongoing huge inflationary monetary problem. There's not that problem in China or in Southeast Asia, it seems. Why is that? How effectively? I was just looking at GDP figures for Singapore recently. Like the Singaporean economy is growing at about 3%, I think, per annum. Its interest rates are something like 4%, and its inflation is below 6%, about 5%. If any European or the Western economy had those kinds of figures, people would be jumping for joy, I think. How's Singapore done that? And I think the picture in China and Asia generally is not as bad as it is in Europe.
This year, ASEAN's trade with China will reach $1 trillion. It is significantly bigger than China's trade with the US, than China's trade with Europe, than Europe's trade with America. And in the coming years, the economies of Southeast Asia and China will grow together. And that's one reason why we are doing relatively well. May I make this point, because it may surprise you, that China was the least damaged economy during COVID. China was the last country to open up, which is the best strategy in an epidemic. China had the fewest number of deaths per million than any other major country. In 2020, while the rest of us were at home behind our screens, and then ordering from Amazon or whatever, and then looking forward to the parcels which are delivered through our doors. Who made the things in the parcels? They're all made in China. So for 3 years, China's factories produced for the entire world. In 2020, China's trade surplus, merchandise trade surplus, was $510 billion. In 2021, it became $670 billion US. In 2022, when you had the Shanghai lockdown and people said that China was really in horror and confusion, China's trade surplus went up to $870 billion. China did not have to print money, unlike Europe or America or Japan. And that's why today, while interest rates are trending up everywhere, in China, interest rates are trending down. This gives the Chinese government enormous policy flexibility. And if China does well, Hong Kong will do well, Singapore will do well.
Very good. The other area that you mentioned but didn't develop very much is obviously, the great problem for Europe and to some extent for China as well is the Ukraine situation. And that, in Britain and America, people are often skeptical about China's, sort of desire for peace in Ukraine. And yet China doesn't give Russia any armaments. And I think from what I understand of Chinese interviewers I've been involved with, they're genuinely quite concerned about what will happen if there isn't peace in Ukraine relatively quickly. I wondered what you could say further about China's role with regard to Russia and the Ukraine situation, and whether any kind of peacekeeping role it could play going forward.
At an abstract strategic level, China benefits from the Ukraine war because it takes away American attention. I mean, the crosshairs, instead of being on China, has shifted to Russia. And I think that takes heat away from China. So at that level, they are a beneficiary. China is triangulating. It doesn't want Russia to collapse, because then China will be fully exposed to Western pressure. So it will help to shore up Russia economically. Militarily, it rather not get involved. In any case, Russia may not need it. So they rather have an intermediate position where they are close to Russia, but seen as a peacemaker. That is a very good position for China to be in, which is exactly the position they're taking right now. To be a peacemaker, to help Russia economically, to stay close to Russia, and to help develop Russia as a separate pole in a multipolar world. They want Europe to be a separate pole. They know that Europe will always be close to America. But Europe has got its own interests. So they're working separately on Germany, on Italy, on France, on Hungary, on others. That look, you have your own interests. Yes, you're close to the Americans. You need the Americans to defend you. But you need not follow the Americans on all issues. And certainly not on Taiwan. That is Chinese strategy. To have a strong Europe, to have a strong Euro. Because this gives them diversification. My own view, if I may be a little speculative, and you will disagree with me, of course, I see the world becoming multipolar. In this multipolar world, China will be a big pole. Russia, a smallish pole, but bristling with weapons. And they'll be quite close to each other. Then, on the other side, you have the American pole, which is very big, also bristling with weapons, and the European pole, which is big, but quite neutered in terms of its military capability. And they will stick together. Then you have India as a separate pole, and there'll be others like Brazil and South Africa and ASEAN as a little cluster, like asteroids clumped together. I think this would be how the world is. And synaptic connections will be very important. They will not be exclusive. They'll all be connections. Singapore will try to have maximum number of connections to all the poles. I think Hungary will also develop synaptic connections in all directions. You see? You can't change how the poles configure because these forces are too big. But whatever the configuration, we find our own connections in order to survive. So this is, for me, a helpful way to look at an unfolding world. And if you know that that's how the world is going, you float in that direction. Then you avoid unnecessary unhappinesses. In that world, the US should be primus inter pares. If I were American, I would help to crystallize such a world. It has always been Kissinger's view.
Yeah.
America should move closer to everybody else. So you have a conflict, I will have the ability to tip it one way or the other, between China and Russia, between China and Japan, between Europe and Russia, move close to everybody. Then you will be the first among equals because you have the culture to do that, because of the English language. And you can achieve primacy with much less effort. Whereas the current tendency to prevent China from rising and to stay dominant, I think is exhausting and financially not sustainable.
There you go. Shobha, do you want?
Okay, so regarding the multipolar tendencies in Asia, how much do you think each country has the capacity to become a pole on its own? Like, can India catch up to the level of China and the US? Can Indonesia become a smaller pole? Can Japan sustain a position between China and the US as a smaller pole on its own?
India will be its own pole because it's got bulk, it's got history, it has geography. Japan, no. Japan will be a satellite of the Americans, principally because it's completely dependent on the US nuclear umbrella. But if the US weakens, then it will seek its own autonomy, as part of which it will go further in the current direction of remilitarization. So for the time being, a satellite. But 20, 30 years from now, I'm not sure. Indonesia will not be its own pole because Indonesia knows that if Southeast Asia is balkanized, it'll be a big problem for Indonesia. So Indonesia's preference is to anchor ASEAN. So ASEAN will have two anchors. Indonesia now, eventually Vietnam also, because they are very dynamic people and a dynamic economy. But none will be able to dominate all 10. But these two will be significant weights in the configuration. And if ASEAN can stick together as a grouping, 700 million people with a significant GDP, it will be a weak pole in that system. And a pole where people feel, yeah, you are fair, you are neutral. And that neutrality is itself a strategic asset.
Actually, I'm a China researcher, so when you mentioned that the elephant in the room is China, I was very happy because I really want to ask this question: that what should we see on China? So when we are watching China, what is the thing we really have to focus? Because of course we all read Economist and those kind of Western papers, and they try to tell a story about China. But with your experience, what would you say? What we have to really understand about China, and what should we focus on in the next coming years, decades?
I've been to Europe over 100 times. I don't think I have more than a superficial understanding of Europe. China is twice the size of Europe in population and in land area maybe 3 times or more. Well, let's say twice. So it's a complex reality. There's no danger that any European will understand too much about China. So when I meet young European friends who ask me for advice, I say, go to China. Find any and every reason to go to China at least once a year. I say it will be good for you, and there's no danger that you will learn too much. Why should you not? If you are a parent, and this economy is going to be bigger than anyone else on earth by a big margin, you better know it, whether for offensive reasons or for defensive reasons. And you should teach your children Chinese, or at least get them interested, because it will be a great asset to them. But the mood now is Confucius Institutes, Oh, there's subversion. I can't, for the life of me, understand the current mood. When I was in Cambridge, Joseph Needham was still master of Gonville and King's College. He had a profound influence on me. His encyclopedic work, Sense and Civilization of China, reached a depth of analysis which even the Chinese themselves appreciated. That scholarship has weakened greatly, not just in Cambridge, but throughout Europe. And yet China is getting bigger. So something needs to be done desperately. Because of my association with the Catholic Church, I have this dream, you know, maybe Hungary can play some kind of a role. I don't know. It would be good if China has a university for classical studies. Not just a language, you know, Roman and Greek, but understand the Roman world, understand classical Europe. And Europe in turn helps China, and China in turn helps Europe develop a university for understanding China. And you need more than a university to understand China. The Jesuits did a lot with very little. And even that, according to Joseph Needham, created the basis of the French Revolution. Because the Jesuits said, remarkably, you have a moral order without organized religion. How could that be possible? Because it was never in the European experience. So he wrote about it, translated the Chinese classics into Latin. According to Needham, the French encyclopedists, men like Voltaire and Descartes, when they read all this, they said, yes, that's our answer to the Catholic Church domination, the Catholic mind suppression of independent thought. And it began a period of dechristianization. But beyond a point, dechristianization is very dangerous because you cut off your own legs. If you're not rooted, how do you change? China, in its transformation, keeps on going back to its own history. So the more your branches grow, the deeper your roots go. But the current mood of Europe is you chop off your legs and said, this will help me to change. To me, that's very dangerous. So when I was briefed on Castle Hill, and why the Hungarian parliament is neo-Gothic and not neoclassical, I say there's a certain wisdom in the way your leaders think. Because don't lose your roots. You lose your roots, you'll be swept away. You'll be cast aside. Now, I do Tai Chi. You know, I think you're familiar with Tai Chi. You know, Tai Chi has a certain principle that the more rooted you are, the freer you are. If you're not rooted, you lose your balance. If you're rooted, you can do pirouettes and maintain balance. So rootedness is very important. Anyway, this is just a view from afar. I feel embarrassed to talk about this because I know very little about Hungary. I just have a slight sense of you, which I like. and I'm just giving you my impressions.
Well, I think they're fascinating.